better policy making. And so I have, I think, probably a bit of an interest in this agenda. I'm sure I'm going to find out a lot more about how interested I should be over the course of the evening. But the Institute, absolutely delighted to welcome you, particularly those of you who haven't been here before, to this event this evening. We're very pleased that we're doing this. This is our first outing with the Royal Statistical Society. Actually have been doing some things under the RSS banner, so it's an absolute pleasure to have both Heaton Shah, their Chief Executive, and John Pullinger, their Chair, here with us tonight. I'm going to get out of the way because John is going to be the chair. That's because we have an IFG person on the panel. Just in case John forgets afterwards, if you haven't been at the IFG before, networking, which is code for drinks and canapes, is an integral part of our events. So we hope you will be able to join us at around 7:30, depending on how many questions we have from the audience outside. The only other thing I would say is, although we're starting almost on time and there are a few spare seats, this event is possibly our most oversold event ever. One of our problems... Oversubscribed. Oversold
Thanks.
If people do emerge, it might be easy if you sort of shuffle up to one side or another in case we do. Forecasting the conversion rate of people who say they're going to come to an event to people who actually come to an event is one of the biggest data problems we face at the Institute, so maybe we'll find out how to cope with that later. But without further ado, John.
Jill, thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure also for the Royal Statistical Society to partner with the IFG for this. There's a huge amount where we can work together, especially on this agenda of better policy making. My guess is a few years ago, in fact probably even a few months ago, an event on bigger and more open data would have been seen as rather niche. But I don't know whether the rest of you have looked at the list of people who've signed up for this event. But it's incredibly broad, and it's the breadth of it that I find so interesting. And all of a sudden, data, big data, open data, whatever you want to call it, is central to the discussion about economic growth, it's central to the discussion about effective policy making, and it's central to the discussion about how we as citizens are going to function successfully in modern society. So suddenly, this is the thing that we need to understand better. We need to challenge ourselves to work out what it means, because it's not necessarily a positive thing. Data, information, as always in the past, can be captured by the bad guys as well as turned into an opportunity for the good guys. And part of this discussion is about how we make that force a creative one for all of us, for our economies, for our politics, and all of us as citizens. So I'm delighted to introduce our panel this evening, which I will do from a piece of paper just so I make sure I get slightly complex job titles right, for some of them at least. And they're going to introduce our discussion with quite short bursts, hopefully around about 7 minutes is what they've promised me, to get us going and get the discussion going. Most of the discussion is going to be about you, what you want to contribute to it, and questions you've got for our panellists. So our panellists, and they will go in this order: Jeni Tennison, the Technical Director of the Open Data Institute; Paul Maltby, the Director of Open Data and Innovation at the Cabinet Office; Fran Bennett, the Chief Executive of Mastodon C; and Julian McCrae, Deputy Director here at the Institute for Government. So now I'd like to invite Jeni to start us off.
So I thought I would just tell a bit of a story about some work that I did recently for one of our partners at the Open Data Institute. So the Open Data Institute is a not-for-profit that was set up by Sir Tim Berners-Lee and Sir Nigel Shadbolt, and we're about a year old. And one of the things that we do is help businesses think about open data and what they can do with open data. So one of the tasks that I had to do recently was to help Telefonica prepare for its big campus party event, where it wanted to put on a hackathon around some of the data that it has about people density around London. So in other words, it has data about how many people are in a given area each hour of the day, how many of them are men, how many of the women, how many are at different ages, whether they're at home or whether they're travelling. And it was interested in making that data available for social good. It wanted to see whether there was some part of that data, particularly around Christmas and New Year, that could be used to help emergency services to plan their provision. Okay? So the first kind of point that I want to make out of that is that we shouldn't just be thinking of open data as something that comes from government and that is consumed by the private sector. Instead, we should be thinking of open data as something that the public sector can use in order to improve its public services, and it can use data from the private sector in order to do that. And in order to do that well, we need to, within government, have the capacity to use data, to understand it, to be able to pull it together with data that they have, and to learn how to mash that together with data that the public sector already holds. So as I was helping them, looking for data that they could compare and combine with the footfall data that they have, I was looking particularly at emergency services kind of data. So I thought, okay, let's have a look at where the hospitals are, let's have a look at where A&E is there anything about ambulances that were called out over this period of time? And it was astonishing how difficult it was to get any data that would actually mash up with this footfall data to create something useful and interesting. It was actually impossible to get hold of a list of hospitals within London and where they were located. When I did eventually find some, it was actually closed data by the license. I couldn't actually use it, and the locations that were there were encoded in a way that made it very difficult to process. And this is a very common problem. Core reference data like this, lists of hospitals and stations and schools, is just difficult to find. And it doesn't need to be that way. This is really important information, and it should be treated with care. It should be published in a very good way so that we can just do these things easily. The other thing that I noticed about trying to get data was that all of the statistics that you could find about ambulances, about crimes and so forth, were all aggregated up to the month level. So this incredibly rich and granular information that we had about footfall couldn't be matched up with this very high-level information, high-level statistics that we had about ambulances. And that basically meant that you couldn't predict, you couldn't use the footfall data to predict where crimes were going to occur or whatever. You couldn't prove that that would be a good thing to do. So we need to be thinking within the public sector about providing data that is a lot more granular in order to enable this kind of big data analytics over when mashed up with the data that was coming out of the private sector as well. So the third point that I wanted to make was that actually I talked about the difficulty of getting hold of a list of hospitals. Well, actually there were some sources for lists of hospitals. Those were Wikipedia and OpenStreetMap. They're public sources, collaboratively made sources of this information, that are incredibly useful. So government doesn't have to provide all of this data, but the problem is that do people trust it? I think that there are two ways that government should be involved in collaborative data efforts like those. One is that they can contribute to those kinds of collaborative data efforts. They can put in data to OpenStreetMap, and they can use that data themselves. The other thing is that I think the public sector should be publishing more data in a collaborative fashion so that other people can contribute to it and add value to it. And this is something that I worked on with legislation.gov.uk before I joined the Open Data Institute, using open data as a mechanism for enabling the private sector to work with the public sector to create shared information assets that can benefit us all.
Jeni, thank you. Straight on to Paul.
Okay, thank you. So it seems quite clear that we're already a fair way into this data decade, a decade that will change how we live and work and think, the ubiquity of smartphones, of Google, etc. And I think also this increasing understanding that the true value in this lies not just from being passive consumers of that data, but being active creators with the data. And I think that applies both to individuals, to organisations, and I think increasingly to government and the processes of government itself. In 14 days' time, I think, we are welcoming over 1,000 delegates to the Open Government Partnership Annual Summit in London, under the banner of transparency and an idea whose time has come. And there's something in the air here about open government, about open data. We're seeing the Open Government Partnership, this sort of club of reformers within governments, increased from 3 years ago when it started through to 60 or more now. And I think driven by, on one hand, thinking within the international development field about the importance of transparency as a disinfectant for democracy to help reduce corruption and improve governance. And you see a good number of middle-income countries, particularly Latin America elsewhere, in the OGP joining to try and seek that competitive advantage within the ways in which their countries are run, and trying to bump them up if you like, the rankings of wealth and governance. The other driver behind some of this is around the understanding that government is a platform rather than just a service provider, this idea from a number of years back. But the data that we have is a critical resource that others can derive real value from, whether it's social organisations, private businesses, whether personal individuals. So in the Cabinet Office for the Open Data and Transparency team that I run, we talk around open data being a driver of accountability back to citizens with products made from open data like Contracts Finder, government organograms, just to understand the processes and business and spending within government. Secondly, we talk about open data as a driver of improved public services. So the Guardian a few weeks ago did their schools GCSE finder, where you can use open data to understand the performance and choices of schools across the country. And I think on this public service side, it's very interesting how open data starts to play with some of those information advantages that have been between the individual citizen, the bureaucracy, the professionals. And the third thing we talk about is open data as a driver of economic growth. So that may be, a great many of you may have applications on your phones or that you use back in the office or at home to understand about how transport's working, to be able to find the latest bus, tube, train, parking space, whatever. And those organisations, hosted by the Open Data Institute is a good example, providing new business opportunities. It's not just the startups or larger businesses like the ones you talked about, Jeni, using open data alongside their own data and other private sources of data to try and derive those economic advantages. The 2 points about the data as a driver of better policymaking and government. I think first, it's not just the products of open data, which just I've mentioned, but actually there's something about the processes that the technology and the mindset that comes with it start to encourage. Data.gov.uk, the UK's data portal, is not just a provider and sourcer of data from government and a few other places. It's part of a community that interacts. We have, people can request data sets. Increasingly, as we sort of refresh this, people will be able to spot the mistakes and opportunities there are in the data to, hopefully at some point to be able to collaborate on those data sources. We've been doing for the UK's OGP, we've got this national action plan that we've been writing over the last 9 months or so, collaborating with different organisations from civil society. There's all sorts of different examples we've done in government of consultations, some good, some bad. But to me, there's something quite different about the way in which this mindset and this subject has enabled that interaction between the state, individuals on Twitter and with organisations through these processes that I think start to play around with the accountabilities you feel as a civil servant and I'm sure go through the wider political process that I think are interesting and I think will become more widespread across the civil service as the technology and the understanding of this goes forward. The second opportunity is what becomes possible when we start to achieve this mass scale and velocity of data. Within the UK we have 10,000 data sets give or take, that are open and available through data.gov.uk. And more recently, we've identified, we tried to say, look, okay, what are all the data sets that government has within reason? You could count on forever, I'm sure, but within reason, what are the data sets we know are there? And we found another 4,000 data sets that haven't been published or haven't yet been published to get people to understand the true scale of this. And within that, there is a set of data that Jeni referenced that is of particular value to the way in which government works, to which public services work, and perhaps for economic value to a wider scale. We'll be identifying this in the next few weeks as a national information infrastructure, some sets of data where the timeliness or the quality is particularly important. But the real shift here in this point around what happens at scale and volume, I think, is made through our cousins in the government digital service as they start to provide transactional services in government, open source, digital first. Their performance platform that they have on data.gov is a potential source of huge amounts of real-time, high-quality data. So for us in government to be able to understand what is happening in the services that we run in a way that our systems and processes never enabled before, but also potentially as an incredibly valuable resource out there in the wider world for additional products and services and for citizens too, in a way that it's hard to even imagine where that value can end. Of course, being really careful about points around individual privacy and national security as we do throughout this work. The challenge here, though, is that what's our capacity within government to really make sense of the value of the data that is starting to emerge? I don't think it will surprise you that much to say that I think that the capacity is somewhat mixed. In a sort of civil service way, you know, there are both technical and cultural barriers to the way in which, particularly as policymakers, we've thought about evidence and data for a good many years. I think the sense of being a policymaker in this data-rich world in 10 years' time is going to feel immeasurably different to how it was, in fact, almost 10 years to the day when I started back in government. It doesn't feel that different now. I think in 10 years' time, being a policymaker will require a different skill set, a different mindset, and a different ability for our computers to work. But that's but the point is there is hope in here. I think, you know, there's basically on the computers, we're working with the government digital service in the Cabinet Office to improve a proper, rigorous, high-quality IT system that will be loads cheaper and loads better and enable us to take advantage of these issues. There's the Digital Leaders Network, the data capability strategies, and we're starting to make use of organisations, not least through the ODI, Mastodon is a good example, within government that can help provide us that insight. So, you know, training up our own skills, understanding what's needed. We've at least made the mental shift, I think, in the centre of government to understand that this is happening and we need to be there with it. We're just not quite there in terms of having the capability throughout the service in the way that we'd hope to have. So my sense is UK, certainly you know, world leaders in this field, but still not quite first class.
Thank you. Well, you're all playing tag very nicely, actually. So, Fran.
See if I can continue to fit in. So, I come to this discussion as a little bit of an outsider. So, I run a small technology company. We're specialists in building and running technology systems that make sense of these huge amounts of data. And we do that for some private sector clients and for some government clients. And as a company, we are very excited about the opportunity to use data to make things in general run better, so to make services better, make organisations better, really realise the results that we all want. And I think there's a particular opportunity to do that in government. So my first job was a local government consultant, then I went to work at Google for quite a few years and was immersed in data and technology, and now I've had the chance to come back round to trying to apply these techniques and technologies to government and to try and help that, because I think there's so much scope to do that. And we were asked to think about what we saw as the opportunities and the risks for using data more in government. And I would include not just open data, but also closed data, just the raw, the big data that doesn't get used much at the moment. And one thing that really sticks out to me as an outsider is data is not driving policy and it's not driving thinking in government. So government, to me, a government budgeting, government policy making seems to be very much a hierarchical model where, you know, from the bottom layer, maybe people can see exactly what's happening, but that information gets increasingly aggregated up and information and subtlety gets lost, and then finally things are transmitted through the medium of the written report. And that's a pretty shocking way to transmit insight, because if you read that report and then have a question or you want to understand better, you can't go back down to that original data. And that's pretty nuts, because the technology is now completely there to allow you to do that. It's just that if we insist on transmitting thoughts and informations in these very lossy ways, as I would say in the technology field, we can't set good policy, and we're not setting the right policy. So I think that's something really big that I see from the outside. And you know, talking to policymakers, they're not used to being led by data, and they sometimes think they are, but then they really don't have that questioning approach and don't allow themselves always to be led by, if the data tells them something they don't like or didn't expect, that's fine. We just look at the data again. So we have to keep looking back at what really is there rather than what our theory tells us is there. And that's quite a big mental shift. And it's a very big skills shift. So it's a shift from being a classicist to being a computer scientist. And that's completely different worlds. And I also see huge opportunities to use data better in government services themselves. So government services are obviously very important, very, very highly transactional things. So thinking of, you know, tax data, or thinking of all the interactions that people have with social services, for example. Again, we're applying very crude rules across the whole of the system, or at least across a local government area. And we're not tuning the services to the people. We're not using the data that we have to put resources where they're needed. So in this current environment where we have very limited resources, there's a greater impetus than ever to start trying to be smart about using data to put resources where they're needed and to not put them where they're not needed. And that sounds like an obvious point, but I don't see it happening. And a big part of that, I think, is the understanding of how to use data and the technology ability to do it. Now, all the pieces are there, but government doesn't yet have them together, and that's a real important impetus, I think. And then, of course, with open data, there's also the transparency side of things. So for citizens, imagine we're in this magical world now where policy is set based on data. There are very rational discussions about what the data tells us, and then we do things that are rationally prescribed by that. Now, if you can share that with citizens, you can have a sensible conversation about why resources go to where they go to, and to be much more transparent about how government is operating. So not just sharing pieces or sharing particular slices of what's going on, but actually genuinely having a discussion around what the information tells us and why we make decisions we do. And that goes back to Jeni's point about, you know, where are the hospitals? If we're in a world where we can't get a simple list of the postcodes of hospitals in the UK, it's very hard to have that kind of detailed, nuanced conversation. So I'd say the very first step is actually getting the raw data and thinking in terms of the raw data that we slice many different ways to get a real picture of what's going on. And finally, this is not a question I have an answer to, but you asked about biggest risks, and as something of a practitioner, I see a really big risk coming down the track in terms of regulation of data. So for me, as someone who uses data, I want all of the data. I want the most raw data I can. I want to collect loads and loads of data and use it lots of different ways to build things, to make things, to understand things. I also know that although, in my view, data is a neutral stuff, models are not neutral. Models can be used very powerfully to help people and to harm people and to do all sorts of very good and very terrible things. So I know we're going to need some regulation about how data is used. I don't think we have it yet. There's very little guidance for me as a practitioner about what I can or should do with data. And I think policymakers need to start to understand this world in order to regulate it appropriately so that we get as much as possible of the good stuff out of the data and as little as possible of the bad stuff. I think government is very cautious in regulating itself. The commercial sector is the complete Wild West at the moment in how we collect and use data. And I'd really like to see that made more orderly, but in a way that doesn't stop us using data well. So that's the end of my thoughts.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And Julian.
Excellent, thank you. My colleagues are very well aware that I'm a bit of a data geek. I started my career a little while ago when big data was a 7,000 household survey with about 100 data points on each household. Working about 6 years, I wrote and rewrote tax and benefit models of that data. And one of the most interesting things, we worked at the Institute for Fiscal Studies. We had 1 million+ data points. The thing that was influential and the thing that mattered out of all of that 6 years of modelling and work was reducing that to 10 data points. It was, if you look at the papers the day after the budget, you'll find a decile graph produced by the Institute which tells you whether the rich have gained or the poor have lost, or whichever way around we are at the time. I used to produce those. I can tell you now that they don't mean what you think they mean. There are a load of different data issues knocking about inside that. My particular favourite is the translation between the raw data that's actually collected and the derived data that the data providers, the survey company, actually gave to researchers. And they just fill in all the bits that are odd. So it looks as though this is the perfect survey with no one answered oddly. And most users of the data don't actually know that there's a difference between the two or know what's being done in between. Now, that didn't actually matter. It never worried me that I was producing stuff which on a technical level I can give you 10, 15 reasons why that doesn't say what you immediately think it says, because I was confident that it said enough about what you need to take away from this, and it said in a way that you could understand, that it was well worth doing. So it told you, for example, income tax changes in the UK, basic rate lowering. People used to think back in the 70s and 80s that this was really good for people who were in lower incomes in the UK. Actually, when you do these charts, you will show that it pretty much affects only the top half of the income distribution, and it's people in the 9th decile, second richest 10%, who gain the most. And just repeating those 10 points of data of every variation of policy change government did had a huge effect, not just on people's understanding, but policymakers' understanding. It became known that this was what was going on. Now, why did I talk about that? Well, we did some work at the Institute a couple of years ago, a long-running puzzle for us, for Whitehall. Whitehall doesn't use its own data about itself, or indeed its public services, management information in the sort of jargon, what's going on inside our organisations. It's actually much better at some other types of analytical data we'll come back to. And we were kind of, well, what's kind of going on here? And we thought we'd have a look at sort of, we love researching successes at the Institute. It's a lot easier to research things that people call successes. And there was, one of the best examples I saw on that was, it's a large comparison of processing centres. So it's a very basic business problem, which are performing best, which are performing worst. And for various reasons, simply because no one had really asked the question, they finally got round eventually to producing some productivity information across those call centres. Now, the first cut of that data, which went to the management group with the director of operations sort of sitting there, was dismissed out of hand, told that director of operations nothing. Well, actually, it told them something. It told them the difference in caseload. Some things were processing disability benefits. They're much, much longer than straight JSA, job seekers allowance claims. Okay? What was crucial was that the process didn't stop there. That data process, it was the finance in this case, went away, recut the data, started to try and control roughly for the caseload mix, came back about 3 times, took them about 9 months to a year to actually do it, till the director of operations said, I don't know what's causing that variation, okay? And that's interesting, and I'm going to dig into it. And at that point, it spun out into a serious management tool that director could use. Now, the crucial bit in that story is, again, it was the knowledge, this was reducing loads of data, this is real-time information about what you're doing over 15-minute cycles reduced down to 30 data points. The person at the other end, receiving end, knew how to interpret that data and could do a lot of the quality control that quite often we're doing in statistics and stuff like that. So context mattered a lot as to who was using it. Why is it so important for Whitehall? That we have a tendency not to have experience in the room when we make decisions. In all kinds of ways. You might think that's a description of politicians. It's also, rather unfortunately, sometimes a distinction of senior civil servants. You will very rarely have the operational people there when you're discussing it. Data, going back to your point about good and bad guys, good and bad use, becomes really dangerous in that. Had they had that first cut of data in a cabinet discussion on what we were doing and improving the performance, no doubt we'd have said it up to the 75th threshold and we'll just do it, to which the policy answer was abolish disability benefits. That would not have been a good idea. What goes on, that's one set of examples. What do we have to do? Do we understand who's our decision maker, what data they need, and how we get it to them? And we'll come back to skills in a second. Second sort of big set of issues is cultures. Public sector has a lot of organisations which have very strong cultures within them. One of the most interesting bits about a big data example we came across in that work, it was, I won't actually say because I'm not allowed to say which area it was, but it's a public service which has dominant professions and management who are clashing against each other. There are about, I know of 3 different public sectors that fit that description, so you can't actually tell which one it is. What the people who were collecting the data were doing, They moved on from data collection, producing metrics, to actually trying to interpret what are each of the tribes thinking about when they come to the crucial sets of decisions, there's future recruitment decisions in this case. Why are they constantly ending up at log jams? Okay, so can we express what they're thinking in data for them, for that tribe? Then can we bring the tribes together for the usual decision-making meeting, but we're putting the data at the center of it. You've all got your own interpretations, but the data ultimately is reasonably reconcilable by a group of professionals around the table. Can interpret that. Opinions, very, very difficult to reconcile. People just stay in their opinions. So they were really using the data, and the reason the big data was important, you had enough cuts of this to give each of the tribes information they could bring to the table. When it's just very sparse data, you basically get one interpretation, your analysts have done it. Big data allowed everyone to come to the table with information and then use information to aggregate up to a decision. Final sort of set of thoughts. So what are we doing in transparent data about the tribes in Whitehall? 2 tribes I think are fascinating at the moment. We've got some data people, or visualization people, big data people. Government data service, whenever I talk to people, they describe them as different to normal Whitehall. I think Paul used the phrase cousins in the government digital service, which I was quite intrigued what a cousin was in Whitehall terms. Anyway, I'll talk about that later. But that tribe is in there now, working with some of the other analytical tribes that knock about in Whitehall. The other one is, of course, the public. We do our own sort of very, very small data sort of piece. People see on our website we have a thing called Whitehall Monitor, which we publish a load of things because we believe data is improved through use. And the more we use data, I get phone calls from regular basis. Actually, when 2 people in this room ring me quite regularly to say, you're kind of getting the interpretation wrong. Actually, we did something in the background. I know it says it's supposed to be this, but actually you've got to understand these nuances. Our sort of answer to that is pretty standardly, that's great. Publish it in its corrected form. If you continue to publish it saying it's this, we continue to use it saying it's this. We want to drive quality of data as much as we want people to be using that to interpret. And those sort of cycles are really, really important. So how do we understand that in transparency, into transparency? Where do people have an interest, what they want to do, and how do they make that work? One final thought on transparency before I stop. Huge issue about public services moving beyond the control of the state into private sector markets. We've been doing it for 20, 30 years. A lot of basically poor contracting is coming home to roost at the moment. We have, in a recent report by my colleague Tom Gash, looks at what you can do about improving this. Transparency is absolutely crucial in those contracts. Most interestingly, you will find the discussions going on in a lot of the big private sector providers are moving now towards we have to be transparent about performance because the reputational risk to us of not being is being demonstrated very clearly. So you may actually find that traditional private sector commercial, we must hide it, actually switches round to be we have got to, when we're dealing with government, we've got to be transparent, otherwise we get caught out by this. So I'll leave it there, but there's some thoughts about what the opportunities are around data and how they fit with some of the cultures we meet in the public sector going forward.
Well, thanks to all of our panellists. I mean, you've all been informative, challenging, provocative, but perhaps best of all, very disciplined. So we have a huge amount of time now, which is what we wanted, to get some contributions and thoughts and provocations from all of you. If anyone is in the room behind and wishes to make an intervention, so I won't be able to see you, do come in here if you want to speak. And if you're in the room, stick your hand up and I will try and recognise you. I'll take a few questions at a time, but please, there is a roving mic, wait for it to come. And if you could identify yourself as well in whichever way you think is most appropriate, then that will be helpful to our panellists. And let's see how we go. Who would like to begin? Please.
Just the one question at the moment, not doing 3. So Toby Price, I'm an independent consultant working on IT strategy with government and education at the moment. So my question is around with the volume and variety of data in the open data sources, should we be focusing our efforts on understanding information at the metadata level, i.e. agreeing definitions and agreeing what the information means, or should we be focusing more at the data scientist level and digging down into the detail and working through that? So is it top down or bottom up, essentially?
Okay. Did I see someone else over here? Please, this one.
Hi, Chris Fleming, Government Office for Science. The discussion about a list of hospitals was interesting, and Paul's discussing the National Information Infrastructure, which will set out, you know, all the data sets that exist. What about the lists of things that don't actually exist? What do you do about them?
List of things that don't exist. Before you have microphone.
A list of hospitals may not exist anywhere.
Oh, okay, okay. Yeah.
So how do you tackle the the data that is useful but that can't actually fall under an open data regime because it.
Okay, we've got it. We've got it. Anyone else for a third one in this batch? Or well, let's have answers to those. Jeni, do you want to start? I think both of those kind of work quite nicely with your presentation. Then we'll see whether others want to contribute.
Well, I'll certainly take the second one because but I think I'll leave the first one.
Okay.
It's okay. So I think that's a really good point, and it's why I think that simply getting a list of all the data that is currently held by government isn't the right way of thinking about the national information infrastructure. I think what we should be thinking about is much more from a top-down view of what do we know that we need to have information about, and how do we make sure that as government we are collecting that information ourselves, or making sure that somebody out there is collecting it and that we can use it. My kind of usual example of this is school catchment areas, where nobody captures school catchment areas. In fact, they're very difficult to capture because there are all sorts of different rules in different local authorities and so on. But what you can get, if you do the right statistical analysis over where pupils actually go to school, you can get some kind of fuzzy idea about where a school catchment area is. And that would be incredibly valuable information. But it's not a data set that government currently produces. It's a data set that we have to persuade government to produce, right? So I think that what we need to have is a kind of top-down discipline sit down and think about what it is that government needs to be collecting, what it needs to be publishing in order to support the infrastructure of information that we need in this country.
Okay, thank you. Paul?
Yeah, just on this point about the national information infrastructure, I think we are trying to think of it in that way. It's 85% agreed, really. So the idea is, with the team, we're like, okay, so for instance, where are all the hospitals? How well are they performing? How much money is spent on them? How many people work there? So trying to think from the users that we interact with, whether they're public sector, social or private sector users, what's the valuable data that there is? Now, I suppose we're trying to work with the data we have rather than the data we haven't got, but you know, maybe the school catchment areas is an example of where that's actually closer to being possible.
Fran, do you want to pick up the point, the top-down, bottom-up metadata versus data scientist?
Yes, definitely. So I bring my own prejudice to this, but in my opinion, it would be best to start focusing on just getting the data out there in raw form, maybe messy, maybe wrong. That's very likely, actually. But just as a raw material, that's what we need to start working with. I think if we focus right now on metadata and definitions, we could argue about that for 10 years and never get anywhere. So we would have a very small amount of very clean and well-defined data rather than a mass of potentially messy and medium quality data, which we then work around. So I'd much rather have the latter, have lots of data. And to take that example you mentioned, for example, we might want to know how well our hospital is performing. Defining how well does a hospital perform is quite a task, and you've probably got a lot of committees already working on what does that metric mean, how do we define it. That's a worthy task, but in the meantime I would like to know what raw data do we have about hospitals, and can we see it, please? So do we have data straight out of systems about who's admitted for what, when, where were they referred from? Because maybe I'm not interested in how well a hospital is performing, maybe I'm interested in the pathways for people with a particular disease, for example. So I've got a different view on that data.
Okay, thank you. Julian, do you want to add something?
Well, I just want to pick up on that last point, because I think it's kind of a great illustration of the tribes sort of issue in this. You know, there are different ways of dealing with data and different standards that different groups bring to it. So quite often statistical sort of validity and process will focus you in on really what do we know what this data actually is? Can we be absolutely sure what it's saying? A slightly more, you know, a lot of the finance sort of community involved in decision making in large businesses will be far more focused on we need the information real time. We can rely on the interpretation coming in at the management level or at the informed level. And I think we just need to have a bit, you know, I do get slightly nervous about performance of hospitals. I know what league tables do, and I know what it does to the... You see these cycles in the public sector all the time, where things get interpreted and therefore good data gets killed off before it's become good data. And we just need to make sure that we've got a grown-up debate, and we need to be very, very clear what the biases when things get into public and come with those labels are. Because the interpretation, you know, my colleagues from the press in the room will know that there are lots of things I say that are not stories, but there are ways I could dress them up to be stories, and it's very, very simple to do that without actually adding any information. So we just need to make sure that we know exactly what we're doing. And if that means that we have to put the data in, you know, you've got to, it's both sides, but we need to get it out so people can use it in ways that allow us to disclaim you can't just put this together and then say this was useless or this was good, unless you can add some more insight into that than just putting the numbers together.
Thank you. Did I see a hand right at the back? Two at the back. So on the other side first, if I may, and then so those two, and then one in the middle here.
Stephen Almond from DEFRA. I'd just be interested to hear the panel's views on what the right model is for getting data out there. Should government and the wider public sector be pushing data out, or should it be actually sending data out on demand based on what customers actually want?
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Emma Thwaites. I used to work at the IFG, and I now I'm a consultant working at the ODI. I happen to have been reading Sir Ken Knight's report about the future of the fire service in the UK. It's a report called Facing the Future. And this is a completely self-interested question, by the way. I'd be really interested to, one of the things that Sir Ken says in his report is that it's very difficult when you're faced with challenging spending cuts in the public services, even if you have analysis and statistics to back up your argument, when you're dealing with very emotive issues like closing people's local fire station or their local A&E, even if you have the data and the analysis, it's actually very difficult to overcome those emotions and those ideological arguments. And I just wonder how the panel feels that data can be used to make better arguments and perhaps give the public better access to the analysis so that they can see for themselves what the real implication of policy making actually are.
Thank you. I'm going to take this one here and I'll come to you next.
Thank you. My name is Mark Detcher. I work for a public affairs firm called Westminster Advisors. My question is about privacy. We've all seen the PRISM scandal unveiling recently, and there's also some legislation at the EU level which may well tighten up data protection legislation in this country. I'd like to ask whether either of those two things worries the panel, and as a supplementary question also how you find the right balance between using people's data responsibly while also maintaining their privacy.
Thank you. Paul, do you want to start on this?
Yeah, okay. Just on this point about the ideological and emotional bit, it's like, as a civil servant, it's sort of the last world I want to live in is one where civil servants fed only by data are deciding public policy. I think it's just, let's be clear, there's a really important point about emotional involvement in all different aspects of what the state does. And of course of ideological ones, and the role of politicians within that is really, really important. So I don't quite agree, you know, there's something about the premise that doesn't sound quite right for me. But having said that, this point about getting to the stage where data is just naturally in and around, sort of the examples that Fran gave and others, you know, have experienced. I think as policymakers, as operational service deliverers, whatever we call ourselves as civil servants, partly we don't know what we don't know. And doing this role over the last year or so, opening my eyes to the types of knowledge that you can have access to, particularly in the real-time area, the ways in which people can quickly and simply start to layer data that provides a richness of insight that as a policymaker, you know, it's not that many years ago where, you know, if you had a certain amount of time allocated to working on a policy issue, that if I was working in a strategy function, so it wasn't sort of the thing I owned, you could spend a lot of your time trying to find the data. And, you know, we get comments, recently actually even from ministers not associated with us, saying that when they're trying to find out about a particular subject and they're wanting to get a different angle in, they're using things like data.gov.uk to know that there is a data source here that somebody, so who is it who has that data source, and why isn't this data being fed into me? So it's a rather simplistic version compared to the type of richness and possibilities that I'm sure exists elsewhere, but I think can exist in government. The point about privacy is, the point that it's almost like saying there's like a biting point where the sort of the privacy and the utility sort of come into balance. I think it's not really quite like that. I think there's advocates on open data that are the strongest advocates of personal privacy that I've come across. These are not in two sort of opposing camps. It sort of comes around because your understanding of the power of what analysis can do for privacy. We take this very seriously on the transparency board within central government. Fiona Caldicott sits on that as a privacy champion, and each of the departmental boards similarly like that. We obviously work, the Data Protection Act is a really important part of the landscape, and there's reviewed guidance from the Information Commissioner about the anonymisation tools and techniques, and increasingly from the Chief Scientist's Office as well, thinking about are these up to speed? Are we being sufficiently careful about that? So I'm not sure if it's not necessarily just a simple trade-off between these two things. We take both very seriously, and look, there's beyond the sort of national security and the privacy side, this is just huge wealth of data. Some of it gathering virtual dust, sitting on civil servants' machines, not well used, not well employed, and creating value in the wider world. And there's really so many places to start before we have to go anywhere close to that, I'd say.
Thank you. Julian, you touched on this question of emotional versus rational in your presentation. Do you want to pick up that one, or either of the others?
Well, I think it's just it's a classic example. Nothing changes about politics and political decisions. I mean, they are fundamentally difficult and have competing interests. That's why we use politics to try and resolve them. Data is very, very useful in that space. It's very, very useful if you've ever been in any kind of conflictual space. Being able to structure it around facts is very useful as a starting point, but you've got to have agreement that these are facts. If you go into that decision where you're having an argument about the facts, then you're even worse position than you were just having an argument about the issues without facts. So it's kind of what's critical in this then becomes, have we thought through enough what the voices are that hold political legitimacy? And too often we default to saying, it's clear that our politicians hold political legitimacy, but there are other institutions we use in a lot of decision making which hold effective political legitimacy. It matters. Other countries use those institutions. What does that look like from some of our most contested decisions, which actually allows the politics to make a set of decisions that people can understand and rationalise? So there's I think it's more than a data point. It's your decision architecture, and how's data fitting into that is a help in it. And how do you put credibility behind that data, which is not simply data itself. It's who's saying and who's doing what inside it. If I can just pick up just on the push and pull point as well, just very quickly, I would always say it's got to be, data has to be pulled. You want people wanting it. The question for government is how do you construct an architecture which allows people to actually realise what's there and how they can pull it. What are the machinery of doing that? Push is pure push, generally gets you an awful lot of things that people aren't using. My thought on that.
Okay. Fran, do you want to comment particularly on that one?
I actually wanted to pick up on the question of asking about PRISM and responsibility versus privacy. And actually, well, certainly the PRISM programme is enormously disturbing. And the comment that it was only metadata that's collected is neither here nor there, because frankly you can learn an awful lot from metadata, so it's inherently very easy to do bad things with that data. But I think responsibility versus privacy is actually false opposition. So it's about responsibility versus irresponsibility with data. One of the ways you can be irresponsible with people's data is violate their privacy, and that's surprisingly easy to do. Even using freely given data, it's easy to learn things about someone that they probably don't want you to learn. But it's also easy, it's a bit of work, but it's very possible to use data in ways which are against people's interests. And that's something I really think is important and under-understood. So, for example, if I've got someone's freely given data and I'm trying to get them to gamble at my casino, I can exploit and model people's behaviours in a way that makes them the most addicted possible to my games. And that's using data which they may have given me about, you know, where they live or what they like or, you know, what they want for their dinner. I don't know, I've not built this model, but there are a lot of things you can do with data which are against people's interests without ever taking facts which they didn't want you to give. And I think that's very much ignored, and actually it's a very important fact about how data can be used.
Okay. Jeni, last word on this round of questions.
Okay, I'll go back to, first of all, the open by default, whether you should publish or whether you should only publish what you're asked for. So my basic position is that you should be open by default. If you can publish stuff easily, then just publish it, because you don't know whether somebody else is going to be able to get some use out of it. However, I do understand that there are trade-offs here, right? That you do not have unlimited resources in order to publish data, and so you do have to make some kind of prioritising decisions. It's interesting that the demand side has been, we tend to purely think about demand from outside your organisation and outside even government. We tend to think about what the demand is from business. I would like us to be prioritising based on what the demand is within government and within your organisation. How can you best publish, how can you get the best benefits out of publishing data for your organisation yourselves? And that might be that you can have better sharing with your partners or with private companies who are supplying you with products. It might be that you can enhance your relationship with private companies to help them to give you better data, right? I think that there should be more focus on how open data can benefit the organisations that are actually publishing the data, so that they are motivated to continue to publish that data in a sustainable way. Because the last thing that we want to happen, and it's no good for anybody inside or outside government, if you publish data because you're told to, you hit over the head with a big stick to do it, and then you stop publishing it. And the number of data sets that are published in 2010, when the big sticks were being wielded, and then never since, and therefore cannot be used as the basis of products and services that are relevant now, is astonishing. So how do we get to a sustainable model? We have to be thinking about the benefits that can be brought to the organisations themselves that are publishing the data, and focus on the demand within organisations and within your partners in order to publish it. Just if I can on the privacy bit. One thing that we have been very strong at ODI is to try to resist using the term open when people actually mean sharing. So there tends to be this technique of saying, oh, we're buying into the open data agenda. That means that we're sharing all of our data with these select set of companies that we think will benefit from it in some way and are friends with us. To try to stop the open data the open data agenda being used as an excuse for making data available which should not be made available, and to people that should not be given preferential access. The fundamental principle which we've been trying to push is that if you are making data available to another organisation, then you should be open and transparent about who those other organisations are. And that helps to diffuse a lot of the questions about where that data gets shared. The other thing that I just wanted to say about this is that we do have, we operate within a society, and within a society, then in order to get best value for our society, sometimes then we do give data to people in order to benefit society as a whole. And health data is a really good example of this, where if you can't share any data about individuals' health, then you can't have all of the public health kind of stuff that my dad used to do before he retired. So he bangs on at me all the time about how important it is for health data to be shared with health professionals so that they can perform these analyses and so that you can act better for the benefit of society. And I think that there are other places where that also holds. where as a society we may choose to give up some of our personal data in order to benefit society as a whole, and it's not a cut and dried thing. And where I am concerned around new data protection laws, and that is where my concern lies, that it prevents that kind of, that it may prevent that kind of sharing. But the basic principles of consent, of informed consent, and of openness and transparency about how data is shared and how data is used is bottom line.
Thank you. So I have got the first three I saw were the lady in this row just before the break, and Matt there, and Simon at the back. And then I'll come to you, I think there were 3 or 4 over there in the next round.
Hi, I'm Ruth McElmoyle. I work at the Department of Health. I'm interested to know how with the limitations and resources, you can reasonably expect government departments, how do you plan to persuade government departments to spend time and resources making information available unless it directly feeds into their objectives? How can you justify that? Not how can you, but how can they justify that? How can they budget for it?
Thank you. Pass it forward if you could to Matt.
Matt Corris from the Hansard Society. Picking up a couple of the points around policymakers' use of data, how much of a challenge is it for policymakers to find and decide on the right data sets when there are so many data sets out there? I mean, data.gov is obviously brilliant and there's lots of information there, but both within the public sector and looking beyond that into the private sector, how much of a challenge is it for policymakers to get the right data before they even use it appropriately?
Thank you. And right at the back in the window.
Yes, Simon Briscoe, of no sort of dominant affiliation, I'm afraid. The 10,000 data sets on opendata.gov now, I mean, as other people have said, there are relatively easy wins. A lot of it was just republishing statistics and data that was already open in some sense. When we look at the list of 4,000, there's a lot of really interesting stuff that could come out. But I just wonder if we could set expectations as to what would be success. I mean, are we looking at 10 data sets a year or 1,000?
Okay, thank you. Some very crisp questions there. Jeni, do you want to start off with this kind of incentive point? Because that is where you left off.
Yeah, that's absolutely agree. How can we persuade anybody to be opening up data when it costs time, money, resources? And this is precisely why I was making the point that the only way in which it can be justified is if there's some benefit back to the publisher themselves, and finding those benefits is the challenge, I think. I mean, the central push is a motivation, but it's not a motivation that I think is sustainable. I think that we need to be thinking about how we change business models, particularly when the data is currently being sold and being made available through special kind of arrangement to certain people, but not widely. So you know that the publishing process and the publishing, the technology and the processes are already there. It's just that it's restricted. We have to think about how we create business models that motivate people to shift over to making that more publicly available and not so restricted. But I absolutely agree with you that finding those motivation is difficult, and that it isn't a matter of clicking your fingers and overnight stuff comes out. So in other words, I don't have an answer to how you do it, but I agree that it's a really difficult problem.
Paul?
I'm not so downbeat about it, actually. I mean, the first thing is about what would success look like. You know, the last thing anyone really should do is give me a target number of data sets to release, right? Because each data set has thousands of different files, sometimes 1 or 2. It'd be the easiest thing in the world for me to sort of just play around and have an incremental increase. The thing we really have to hit is flipping the default to open. That is the big prize, right? Which comes down to the question about how do you get the incentives to make that work. And honestly, I don't think we're that far away from this. I think, you know, this is not sort of a matter of weeks or maybe a few months. But honestly, I think within sort of 18 months to 2 years, you're going to have a really different both quantity and quality of open data there. I think in terms of the incentives, we've worked hard as a team within the Cabinet Office to work with colleagues around government to try and find a different mechanism than just the sort of the big stick of a prime ministerial letter that says you must do this. And in a number of areas, you see the benefits that is making. So in departments, departments like, say, transport, where I think there's over the last, I don't know how many years, from before my time, so 3 years perhaps, a very significant mental shift or cultural shift, so that understanding that transport services and the role of civil servants back out to the individual can be utterly transformed by the quality of open data that feeds those applications in your pocket. Things like in DWP, the innovations like their now what's it called, Stats Finder, is it something like that? Anyone in DWP will probably tell me. But that to get to that default point where the stats that that the officials can see, you can see also and play around with in a tool that's actually relatively easy to deal with, is again changing that default model. So if we deal with some of the stock of data, I think there is a plan in place. That will happen. It's not the easiest thing. My team work away at it day in, day out, but I think increasingly with the support and assistance of officials working in departments. The next question is then the flow of data, and this back to this point of where can we use the points around contracts and the forms of new data, the GDS transactional services and other services that are, as they become digital by default, become transformed. And I think in not that much time, you will see a really quite great revolution in how the data that's available but rarely seen inside government is actually data that's available and can be seen outside government, so long as there aren't these privacy concerns or national security concerns or indeed legal concerns in some more unusual cases. So I'm not so downbeat. The point about how do you find the data sets, these fabulous people in the Government Statistical Service who are the actual experts in doing this. I think as a policymaker it's often finding, knowing that exists. Once it exists, there are people with very high quality skills and many years of experience to enable you to unlock the understanding of those data sets and the ability to work with them. I think that's kind of well-tried and well-trodden territory, and that service within government is actually sometimes maligned in this debate around our ability to work with data. The Government Statistical Service in many departments, DWP is another example where actually it's deeply embedded in that culture. We're just talking about a different type of volume and velocity of data, I think.
There's good answers there. Do either of you two want to add anything?
I just want to very quickly pick up on the question of incentives, because I think it is actually vital. And it's got to be a business incentive. It's got to be driven by something. It can't be a stick incentive. And actually, if you look at departments' own use of data on themselves, which they should be, the management information you use to manage. The most interesting thing, when the non-exec directors came in 2010, lots of them with big business backgrounds, and started asking, well, what are you managing this organisation by? And it was a kind of like, oh my God, where is the information? And now, why were they saying that? If you go back 30 years ago, in the corporate boardrooms of the UK, they'd have been managing exactly the same way we still are. Data got driven into those organisations because your competitors were driving data into those organisations. It wasn't some invisible hand that created those systems. If you talk to the people who did it, it's very big acts of will by senior management saying we've got to improve this. We've got to invest over actually quite long time periods, and we've got to be really clear how we're using the data for a purpose, not just data, it's information to run. And that's, it's linked in this. If Whitehall started to ask its own business questions about our business, it would create much more demand internally in Whitehall for that. And it's actually very simple ways that can happen. You just need senior people who keep asking the same persistent questions over a short period of time. It will happen. And then a public one is just the open side and pull out of data because it's useful, and actually because it fits our business models. If we reconceive what we're doing as public servants, it just makes complete sense, because like the DFT example, we should be doing that. And so I agree a little bit with Paul. I think you're not that far off it, but there's a culture change there that's embedded in a business model of Whitehall, and those are quite big things, but you can change those in years if you put your mind to it.
Thank you. Jeni, you wanted to come back?
Yeah, and it's just to follow off on that point. I don't know if anybody else saw or read Tom Steinberg's testimony to the Public Administration Select Committee last week, where he taught specifically about how to make open by default actually happen, and the key to it that he felt was embedding the openness and the ease of publication into the products that you procure, right? So if you've got the management information system there that produces public data, that publishes that data as a matter of course, then it's very, very easy to get to open by default. If you have the kind of system that lots of places currently have, where any kind of change costs you tens of thousands of pounds, then of course it's very difficult to get to an open by default kind of strategy. And I would really like to see more emphasis both in the procurement of tools that are used within government, but also within the tools that are produced by government, particularly by GDS, of doing that open data publication by default, just as a matter of course, so that it isn't an extra cost, it's just what happens.
Thank you. Now, there's lots of hands, and I want to give everyone a chance to have a voice. So I'm going to try and speed things up a bit. But, sir, on the aisle, I think you were next. So there's two, one in front of the other, and then one over this side.
Ben Alexander, I'm here in my capacity as a Crown Commercial Lead at the Cabinet Office. I feel we're using the word data in two different ways in this conversation. I think there's this concept of raw data, and then there seems to be a concept of interpreted data. And so, in fact, Julian, you've come up with two of those. One was your decile analysis of tax effects. And as an aside, there was this interesting point where you said you were happy with how that represented the data, which puts you in a rather privileged position, incidentally. And the other one you came up with is management information, which is absolutely right, but management information, it is not data. And in fact, you spend an awful lot of time actually considering precisely how you are going to take your source data and convert it into things that are readily usable for people to actually take decisions on. So are we using data to mean two different things? And is actually the value of open data more access for people to understand how the information they're using has been processed from the underlying data?
Thank you. Immediately behind you, just pass it backwards.
I'm Mark Pixley from Lambeth Council. For us, the thing that really interests us in making data open and accessible to citizens is that we can sort of start to engage them in a conversation about what are the needs, what are the strengths in the local area, and start to then engage them in a conversation, involve them in decisions about, well, what are the services that we then need to deliver to achieve the outcomes that we want. And there's been some sort of discussions here around, or a couple of people have mentioned that actually, you know, if by using open data, we can start to show people the reasons behind decisions. But I think we need to actually engage people at an earlier stage in the process, because you know, it may well be that if people have got that capacity to understand the data and understand decisions, then actually have they got the capacity then to discuss with us at an earlier stage, because they may have a different insight as to what actually that data is telling us. And it may well be that different insight to officers, to our local members, and it may well be that we end up with better decisions being made to achieve outcomes. So my question really is about the capacity of citizens to engage with government around data, and what should government be doing to develop that capacity?
Great question. Now, chat by the door, please.
Mike Hobday, I work for Macmillan Cancer Supporters, Director of Policy and Research. I wanted to address the issue about incentives for government departments. And I think we just need to talk up the successes and the possibilities more. So Macmillan, for example, does analysis or funds analysis on linked pseudonymised patient data. So if you link, for example, cancer registry data with hospital episode statistics with HRG costing data, you can get really exciting, I think, information and insight about both the outcomes and the cost of different configurations evaluations of care service. And if the Department of Health doesn't do that sort of thing, the NHS is going to go broke. So there isn't an alternative.
Okay, thank you. Julian, do you want to go first, since you were mentioned on the raw versus interpreted data?
Yeah, I was trying to use, I probably didn't use it correctly, I was trying to distinguish between data and information when I was talking, so clearly the raw data and then the information that you can use. But I think you're right. I mean, it goes back to who's doing the interpretation. Part of the open data here is to allow a much wider range of people to actually be the people who are providing the information out of that and open that market up. So it's not controlled by a statistical profession or a finance profession or something along those lines. And it goes back to well, what do you have to give? What's enough information that you have to provide to allow people to do that with the actual underlying data? And the second thing, it feeds into that. I mean, I thought it was a really good question about about when you engage people. I mean, absolutely. If you're not engaging people at the start, if you come to them with an interpretation that you've put on a load of data, you've turned it into information, you miss part of your potential power here, because allowing them to come to their own conclusions is a way of almost validating that interpretation. You don't have to overcome then. Okay, well look, I have to have credibility with you. You mentioned the IFS held quite an important point. I was happy with interpreting this was information that was accurate for the public. Why did the IFS have the ability to do that in a public domain? Because a lot of stuff that people didn't see was we constantly turned down journalists who asked us to answer questions that we felt we can't answer at this stage. Of course I could answer it, but it just wouldn't be valid. So we'd established our reputation with the journalists that we were only going to comment if we really thought this was right. That was part of a reputation building that allows the IFS to comment in a political domain with that wonderful word authoritative. What are those institutions that allow you to do that, or what are those ways of talking to the public that allow you to do that and are tractable? And that's just an open policy making question, of which open data is one part of the answer.
You have the capacity. Do citizens have the capacity? I think was the challenge that Mark.
Well, I think the point is that you've got to have a thought about raw data is very difficult to interpret. Information is easy to interpret if you think about it right. I mean, if I give one example, we did a citizens' jury a few years ago on spending reviews. We converted pound billion into stars. Big stars were made up of 1,000 little stars, and people could understand the relative magnitudes because you could interpret those and they could trade in them. They couldn't understand pound billion. So, it was a very simple, just change the currency into something you can talk to a person about. That's what you're thinking about, but don't try and give them the answers to the question. Facilitate them using the data, which could have been in pounds billion, was just in stars.
Okay, any quick responses from others? Fran?
About the question of engaging citizens, I think you certainly aren't going to get everybody to engage with this, because it's only for people who really are interested in digging into the reasons behind decisions and engaging decisions. But you could say the same about local democracy now. So very few people engage with that process day to day. Most of those people are very possibly over-involved with it and require quite a lot of context to know what's going on. So I engage with my local authority and my local housing authority quite a lot, because I live in a house whose freehold is owned by a housing authority, and I get very cross about them doing stupid things. We have gradually worked with them to figure out what data they base things on, and it's not a lot of the time. But actually having shared data enables you to have a much more sensible discussion that's not based on who you know or who you sat on a committee with 5 years ago, but actually what's really going on, what's not the perception of somebody who doesn't live in the area, but what's the data and the shared understanding of a place in particular in local democracy, and using that to try and develop better policies. And you'll still only engage a small number of people, but those people will be coming with more sensible motives, and you'll be able to have a discussion, as you said, around the data. So your opinions always differ, but at least if you're talking about the same data, you're talking about the same thing to start with.
Yes, thank you. Anyone on Michael's point about incentives? And we partly covered it before.
I hope that Fran would pick that up, but she's probably sick of talking about prescribing analytics.
But Paul does, though.
So I just wanted to reinforce this point about the where you're moving from sort of open data to the open government side. I mentioned the open government partnership, and I think it's this sort of spirit of the colleague from Lambeth explained one version of this, but it's the way in which this it enables a different type of interaction, maybe sometimes with expert outside groups, maybe with expert analytical resources, maybe with the sort of the public that the colleague from Lambeth was talking about. you know, of course government talks to people all the time, there's hardly something new in that, but it strikes me that there's something different about this, and actually something quite precious about it. So, you know, I just don't want that to be lost. It's not just data, it's actually about, I think there's something important about the process of government, the way that starts to play around the accountabilities within government, starts to play around the processes of government and how we're governed. And okay, we're sort of at the corner of this you know, the uses of data in this realm is only really beginning to have that sense of scale. And so I don't want to over-exaggerate it, but I do think there's something important in that we shouldn't just neglect as we're talking about data.
Okay, thank you. Now I'm going to go to a final round of questions, and I've got several people waiting. Can I just see who else is? I've got Sam over there, chap at the back, and there was someone else in the middle here I thought I saw a hand up with earlier. You, sir? Anyone else? That's perfect. Okay, where are the mics? Do you want to pass it to the back first, please?
Hello, Clive Bates from Counterfactual Consulting, former civil servant and occasional data user. I mean, I just want to pick up the point about should you make the data available on demand or just make it available and sort of get it out there. I think there's another level, though, which is to be much more proactive, purposeful, and sort of ambitious in a way about this. And I think that's because you know, there's strong network effects with data. The value of a piece of data goes up the more it can be compared with other bits of data and ratios created and all the rest of it. And I wonder whether we should be just deliberate about the major systems that government deals with, such as, say, the energy system. What is the range of data sets that you need to have to understand that completely? And who is responsible for making sure all of that is available? And there's a lot of good data on the energy system, but you get so far and you suddenly find, oh, I can't find spot prices, or I can't find the spread between coal and gas inputs, or I can't find the carbon price. And suddenly the other data you've got is nothing like as valuable as it was before. And you could say the same with the housing and planning system. Fantastic super output area data, but very hard to blend it with land price data. And I've no doubt it's the same in the criminal justice system, in the healthcare system. So I wonder if you just need a kind of architect for these major systems that government deals with, that's thinking about what is the data that describes the functioning of these and is purposefully making that data available in a way that it can be used as mashed together.
Okay, thank you. And in the aisle.
Carl Allen, I occasionally experiment with groups of people. So I ran this experiment with a group of 6 form students who are all, well, they're fairly good at mathematics. It was over a weekend, it was a data dive. It was for them to measure and solve a problem at borough level. So it came out fairly all right for that weekend. And I would say if they had 2 or 3 more weekends, they'd be fairly capable of actually coming up with a solution to a real problem. But my question, our politicians, our decisions makers have no such experience. Are we asking too much of them?
Good question. And Sam over on by the fireplace.
Hi, Sam Smith, Privacy International. It's nice that others have asked all the hard privacy questions I normally ask. The title of the panel is Bigger plus More Open is Better. And about a year ago, we had a suggestion from the Department for Education that longitudinal data tracking every child from preschool to university should be open data because they hadn't quite understood bits of it. And it turns out killing the pet project of a special advisor is possible, but it's a chunk of work. What process should exist to make sure that one person's better is also a public interest better?
Thank you. So who wants to start with that? I know, Jeni, you talked about the hackathon right at the beginning, if I remember right back to the beginning, and this kind of issue of you get people doing some data diving, they learn a lot, but are our politicians really up to it? Do you want to start with that one?
Sure. Yeah, that's a hard question. I think that there is a basic understanding gap that needs to be bridged in order to understand what the capability of data is and what you can do and what you can't do, and what is important and what isn't important. one of the things that we're doing recently at ODI is we've just got some money along with OKF from the World Bank in order to go out, and one of the things we'll do is train politicians and senior civil servants in developing countries about how to use open data and how to get the best from it. And maybe we need that kind of training here as well. I think that there's nothing that beats actually going in and trying to use some data that means something to you to help you to understand what the limits are and what the opportunities are as well.
Okay, let's pick up any of the others. Julian?
Just can I have a sort of quick question about the architect, which I think is kind of, I slightly flippantly said, look, don't do push to pull. I think it's a classic example of pull, where you're sort of, you want something for a purpose and we need that data to make it work. And to my mind, the architect is, I'd probably put it in a slightly different question. How can you construct a system that can allow multiple architects to come in and try and pull that data out in ways that are useful, subject to resource constraints? And what does a public sector that's really thinking that through, what does that look like? I'm a little bit nervous about leaving government departments to be, is the architect someone who sits in cabinet office who designs the perfect architecture for you? Because I just don't think that's a good use of the information we possess in society. It'd just be easier to let everyone else compete and pull it out.
Okay, Fran?
This question about architecture kind of comes back to the question earlier about the cost of releasing data, I think, which is, I was thinking while everyone was talking about that, take Jeni's hospital example. I really hope the Department of Health has a list of hospitals. If they don't, what on earth is going on? Because they've got bigger problems there than if they don't have that themselves. So fingers crossed they do. If they have that already, it's clearly not sensitive data. You can put it into a CSV or an Excel sheet and put it on your website tomorrow. Putting a thing on a website is not a difficult or expensive task. Even in government, it's not a difficult or expensive task. So why isn't it happening? Well, the only excuse is that they don't have it. And that's a problem. That's not to do with open data. That's to do with basic proper functioning of an organisation, as you were saying earlier, getting the organisation running and actually knowing what's going on itself, let alone releasing that data to the wider world. And I think that's a problem we need to work through. All of the computer systems underlying government, they have databases at their hearts. That's how computer systems work. It's a case of actually understanding that, having some internal technical literacy and starting to pull that data out in a sensible way. It shouldn't be a huge effort. And if it is, then that speaks to something else which needs to be solved internally.
Okay, what about the one man's privacy is another man's openness? We picked that up? Someone needs to.
That's a really hard question.
Thank you, Sam.
Because that is absolutely true. One man's privacy is another man's openness. If I'm building models, I want all of the data. But that data quite clearly can violate people's privacy. So you have to do it case by case and you have to argue it very carefully. I think Jeni's probably got more nuanced understanding of this than I have, but I think Paul
first of all, it's a well-articulated question around this difficult policy topic, really. I said before, we take the privacy around people's personal data very seriously, and they're just essentially well-ordered processes for that to go through. But the broader question I think you ask is essentially one of the political and civic space of how do we determine that? And the answer to that is probably actually simply through our civic and political institutions, with organisations such as yours interacting with government in a way that it would do on pretty much any contested policy topic. So I think there's a difference between the technical sort of accidental loss of people's privacy, or indeed you could say national security or legality, and then one where there are questions of what should government do in the contested space. And I'd bring it back to the early question of what was it sort of emotion and politicians essentially as being really important parts of that. But the dialogue with civil society is part of the richness of that process. I think you've got a technical question there, and you've got a what should government do, which actually is the same as all contested policy topics in some ways.
Right, I'm going to give the panel the chance for a last word, because the reception is beckoning out there. Julian.
My quick last word is just on politicians, which I think we've touched on. I think it's actually, in my experience, most of the politicians know more, are often the best informed people in a room when the decisions are being made, partly because they've got a whole different set of experiences to a lot of the civil servants who are advising them. And quite often what's necessary, it's not that politicians, there are ways of helping politicians understand how to make decisions, how to use data, and how to understand the complexity of it. And actually that becomes more and more important in sort of how you develop and think about a politician is almost a career. And that takes you into some really interesting worlds, especially how do we think about think tanks and other groups which are using information, interacting with politicians, as how do we get them to make sure that they're using data in a quality way? And I think that's fundamental to some of our decision-making processes in politics. A lot of the issues that people have been raising here we haven't even touched on how much bad there could be, but actually how do we unlock good and how do we use those civic institutions beyond just Whitehall to actually really help political decision makers understand what they're thinking about.
Thank you. Fran?
So I've probably been a bit too rude about civil servants and government today, so I want to apologise for that. But I also wanted to say I think certainly government in the UK is on the verge of something very, very exciting in that we've got a very, very good civil servants, lots of good stuff going on, and there's an enormous will on the side of people in the data technology world to try and engage those tools and techniques with government. So I think we're just about to have something very exciting happen over the next few years, and we're certainly very excited about possibly being involved in that.
Thank you. Paul?
Well, I mentioned earlier, like the processes of doing policy in government 10 years ago, I think still don't look that different, obviously different, but not that different from how the process of policy making government look now. I think if you fast forward 10 years' time, partly because of this data revolution that we are now in, it's going to be utterly transformed. And so I think the idea of the IFG or equivalent sort of 10 years ago, trying to have seminars on evidence making in policy or in operations, and the idea that you might try to have some international event with presidents and prime ministers and a huge amount of interest would not have seemed in any way feasible or possible. So my last bit is, isn't it wonderful that we're talking about data, we're talking about using data to transform how government works, how public services work, and how it feeds into the wider economy. That's surely progress.
Okay, and Jeni?
Okay, so my last point is the fairly simple sentence that open data is a tool. It is something that we use in order to achieve some kind of impact. And we're, having been involved in the open data space for quite some years, I'm really pleased to see the maturing of the debate from simply something about we should just publish everything as a matter of course, and that's for no particular reason, but that we think it might have some kind of good, into what are we hoping to achieve from this, what are the benefits, what are the impact, what can we achieve by actually publishing this data. And I think that the focus on data informing policy, on providing innovation into government is a really powerful thing that open data can give us. And we ought also to be thinking about opening up the rules that we use to create the models that Fran was talking about and the processes that we use to make decisions as part of a wider package of open policy making.
Thank you. Well, you've really provoked a wonderful debate here, but I think no one in this room can be in any doubt that the game is changing. And if we think things are going to be the same in 5-10 years' time, they will not be the same. But we're currently at that Wild West stage, to quote one of our panellists, which means stuff is happening out there, good stuff and bad stuff. But fundamentally, this whole revolution is an empowering one, and the question is whether we can take the power to do good things with it. And the sense that I've got is that we really need to invest in learning how to do that, to equip citizens to do it well, but also to think who the intermediaries are that can kind of help us make it happen. And I think that's the strongest message I take from this debate. But I thank all of you for contributing, and particularly hope we would all like to thank our panellists for creating such a fabulous evening. Thank you very much.